Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Backer and welcome to Off the Wall Novels. Joining me as my co-host, as always, is one Pringle Backer. It's very likely he will poop on my shirt. Today I'm going to talk about a short story by David Foster Wallace called Another Pioneer. This is in a collection called Oblivion. I first read this in college, and it was during my great postmodern awakening when I was discovering postmodern literature, and it really blew me away for how experimental it was, but then also just how thought-provoking and weird a lot of these stories got. And Another Pioneer in particular really made me think about storytelling in a different way, because it talks about stories in this very aware postmodern way, and it talks about like a Paleolithic tribe with this very wise kid who can basically answer any question that anybody asks him. And so today I'm going to talk about the framing device that he uses in order to tell this story, and then also just about the very postmodern aware way that he tells the story. It almost reads like a Joseph Campbell analysis where he's using all of these terms to describe the different parts of the narrative arc. Before I get into that, I want to mention that I'm actually releasing a novel later this year called Lionel, Lancet, and the Right Vibe. And this is a novel that I've been working on for close to 4 years now that was heavily inspired by David Foster Wallace and Thomas Pynchon and a lot of the other stories that I cover on this channel. And so I want you to look out for it. I am planning on releasing it on August 15th. Okay, so first of all, I wanted to talk about this framing device. So I think like a pretty familiar version of this is in Wes Anderson's The Grand Budapest Hotel, which if you remember, the story begins, and then I think it also ends this way with people like opening books. I forget, it's been a long time since I've seen that. But similar to that, that is the narrative framing that we get for Another Pioneer. Nevertheless, gentlemen, I fear the lone instance I can recall having heard aloud derived from an acquaintance of a close friend who said that he had himself overheard this exemplum aboard a high-altitude commercial flight while on some type of business trip. We actually get quite a few different narrative layers here introduced in this one sentence. And so the narrator that's telling us the story in first person is addressing a room full of gentlemen. The story that he's about to tell you, he got from an acquaintance, and that layer of framing is addressed a few more times throughout the story, but this acquaintance heard this from a close friend of his who overheard this story being relayed on an airplane. So we have the story, the friend who overheard the story on the airplane, the acquaintance of that friend, and then the narrator that's telling this to a room full of gentlemen. And then throughout the story too, Another Pioneer that is, it's revealed that there are different versions of this story that exist, and variants and subvariants, and each of these have different details alongside of them. And so from the very get-go, we get something that somebody might call like an unreliable narrator, but I don't really care for this because I think sometimes the concept of an unreliable narrator becomes one of those literary terms that people just use, and it sort of prevents further investigation into this complex idea, because it's like, oh, unreliable. We can't trust what they're going to say. The details are murky. But I think that there's actually more going on here. What we see really is the idea that this story is being passed through a lot of different perspectives. And then also the story that's being passed through these different perspectives is supposed to be very old too. It's supposed to come from like the Paleolithic era. Even through all of these different retellings and being filtered through different perspectives, there's actually still something essential that passes through. And I think this actually hints at what the overall story ends up being about, which I'll discuss in greater detail later. So I'd also like to ask at this time, if you've made it into the video, I hope you're appreciating some of the things that I'm sharing. If you would please like and subscribe, I would appreciate it a lot. Or consider following me on Instagram at Daniel Backer Author. So one of the details that I like about this story too is that the narrator points out to the gentleman that he's talking to that the story that he's about to tell them doesn't have any certain context. And so the narrator tells this room full of gentlemen, meaning that there was no inframing context or deictic antecedent as such surrounding the archetypal narrative, as of course there is with all of us together here this afternoon. So the ironic thing about this line is that this story never mentions that context of this narrator talking to this room full of gentlemen. It is mentioned that each of them perhaps has also shared a story, and it's the narrator now just sharing his story, and the line that shows that I leave it to you to judge for yourselves, as of course you each in turn have left it to us as well. And so I think that this implies that the other gentlemen gathered there in the room on that afternoon have also shared their big mythic archetypal stories, and now it's just the narrator's turn. And he's saying, there's no context to this story, but we all know the context of why we're all here today. And it could be some sort of literary symposium. It could just be a group of people gathered together sharing stories. Maybe they're sharing something other than stories, but ironically, we don't know. But as the story continues, even by stripping away all of those contextual things that might guide us towards some sort of interpretation, we actually still get an assertive statement, making this something that I think would fit into David Foster Wallace's attempts through his career, stated attempts to make postmodern fiction, which I've described in other videos that I'll link within the description in this video. So some of the other versions of like postmodern deconstruction that I say read a little bit like a Joseph Campbell analysis include all of these different literary terms that he uses, such as like catastasis. A lot of them are in italics. Some of them are French. He explicitly mentions like the different acts of the story that he's going to tell. So this hyper-aware cerebral telling ends up being thematic. So note the contrast between the old myth and the intellectual academic style. This style provides a critical framing, but it also evokes the idea of knowledge and intellect. And you could also call David Foster Wallace's style self-conscious, like almost in a bad way, which the story ends up exploring, how knowledge can actually lead to self-consciousness. And David Foster Wallace has explored that in a lot of his writing. Okay, so now that we've gotten all of these things out of the way, the framing devices, the Joseph Campbell-like literary critical terms, we get to the actual story of Another Pioneer, which is that there is a village that it could either be in Asia or South America. It's somewhere in the jungle. He points out that it's actually unclear. And there is a very wise child that can basically answer any question that gets put to it. And at the beginning of this child's life, he is just a bit of an amusement for the village, but then as he grows up, he ends up becoming very important. And it becomes clear that this child is a little bit more than just a child within the story. David Foster Wallace, as the writer, is aware that you will be trying to extract some sort of meaning from the story, and so just to complicate things and to make it more fun, he gives you a potential meaning along with the details of the story that are supposed to evoke that meaning. And it becomes clear that this child's wisdom and his ability to answer almost any question that people ask him is a bit of a metaphor. It could be a metaphor for the way that our brains grew, and the development of language and the development of abstract thought, or like the Adam and Eve story of them gaining knowledge and realizing that they're naked. He actually mentions that specific passage from the Bible. But again, all of this aside, within the story, it starts out where the villagers ask him questions just about daily life, about how to find different yams. They're like, oh, okay, should my wife have to go down and get a jug of water to carry back, or is there a way we can divert the river? Kind of practical, mechanical things like this. And the information and the answers that he gives to these villagers in response to these questions ends up completely revolutionizing their village. And it's mentioned that it creates an economy, and then there's a consultant class that arises in order to help people phrase their questions in order to yield the most maximally beneficial answer to their question. All right, so as the story develops, I mentioned this earlier that it actually splits into 3 different variants, where there is another tribe that's known for being very dominant and very warlike. They become fearful because this other tribe, the one with the kid in it, it's developing so rapidly they think that it could pose a threat. So before I get into the variants, all of these variants result in the same way, which is that the child ends up in this catatonic state where he withdraws into himself, which I think is also interesting because this is very similar to the character of Hal in Infinite Jest and a lot of the different themes that David Foster Wallace explored in his writing, which is that knowledge and wisdom is a bit of a burden, and it comes at some sort of like emotional cost or some sort of disconnection from other people and from community and that sort of thing. In the first variant of the story, the shaman from that dominant warlike tribe asks the wise kid a question that makes the child shut down, and he apparently whispers it in his very small ears. And then in the second variant, the shaman gives him a breadfruit that has a spell on it or a potion involved with it that makes the child go catatonic and withdraw into himself. In the third variant, the shaman, it's said that he just takes on a more oracular role where he says that their rapid evolution will actually be their undoing. And then I guess there are like sub-variants too, where it says that there might have been like a daughter within the wise child's village that asks him a question as well. And it's also alluded to that it could just be puberty, that like the first rush of testosterone in his veins is what makes him go catatonic and withdraw into himself. And so I think this is interesting because it shows that almost like the details don't matter. Not just that the details are unreliable, but it's like there is some sort of essential awakening that happens. It could be from the complexity of the question that the shaman asks. It could be from this spell or this potion. It could be from the daughter, and maybe there is some sort of sexual awakening involved. It could be from puberty. But whatever happens, it makes him self-conscious and withdrawn, and he doesn't answer any questions for a while after that. Okay, so then after this sort of catatonic episode that takes him out of commission of answering questions for several lunar cycles, he comes back and he's answering questions again, but then things are different now. It's more complex. When somebody asks him a question, it's clear that he's not just going to spit out some sort of direct answer to the question that they ask him. David Foster Wallace mentions that at first he's a bit like a Boolean computer, that for example, if you ask him if he knows something, he's like, do you know the best way to do this or that? And he'll answer yes. And I forgot to mention this, but also the villagers are only allowed to ask him one question like every month or so. And so that's why the consultant class arises, in order to phrase your question, in order to actually get a good answer, instead of just being like, hey, do you know the best way to do this? And he's like, yes, I do. Next. Now that he's awakened from this catatonic episode, he is answering these questions in a more complex way that actually acknowledges that there is a question and a larger network of information that's being asked. And again, this hints at this idea of the awakening of abstract thought, the burden of knowledge that ends up descending on humanity and making us self-conscious, etc. But also, it renders the consultant class obsolete. I think that in a way, this part of the story, or maybe the story in general, is talking about AI in a different way, because he does mention a lot of details about computers and uses computer-like descriptions in order to describe this myth. So some of these computer-like descriptions that he gives for this Paleolithic myth include that their primitive CPUs tried frantically to reconfigure themselves after they were given information from the wise kid after his catatonic episode, where now he's answering them in more complex ways. And it says, like, some of the questions that they ask him are like, my daughter is willful. Should we cut her clitoris off now or later? And he's like, have you asked your daughter's mother what she thinks? Or what might one supposed to be the equivalent of a clitoridectomy for willful sons? And giving these more complex answers that make the villagers' CPUs overload. So another one of these computer descriptions that he gives is, I guess, GIGO. I don't know if that's pronounced gigo, and it's a phenomenon of garbage in, garbage out. I'm not going to get into this too deeply, but I guess this has to do with data. If you put bad data into a system, you're going to get bad data out of it. And that's like the sort of primitive Boolean answers that he would give to people's questions at first. Do you know the answer to this? Garbage question. Yes. Garbage answer. I think all of that hints to maybe the idea of AI, and even if it's not specifically AI, I think it is just supporting this larger theme about the idea of advanced knowledge within society, which I think makes it fun because he is talking about this myth from the Paleolithic era that's supposed to maybe inform us about something about humanity's past. But then when you strip all of the details away through these different framing devices and postmodern aware deconstructions, you actually get something that tells us perhaps about the future, about how AI, or something that could answer us our questions about very complex things beyond a simple like Boolean computer way, would be our undoing and like render different parts of society obsolete. Anytime that information or knowledge is introduced within a society, there's a cost, and that it changes things within that evolution. And this is perfectly in line with the other themes about how knowledge is not necessarily a good thing, which is ubiquitous in David Foster Wallace's work. So then This is leading us toward the end of the story and a bit of an assertive conclusion among this total mess of postmodern deconstruction and awareness and frame narrative that this story began as. So in one of the variants, this displaced cast of consultants who no longer have any place in society because it's not necessary anymore, because the wise kid can now answer questions and address the larger abstract network of knowledge into which his answers fit. They theorize, well, what was the question that was posed to him that made him go catatonic? And I think this is both the conclusion or answer that sort of unifies all of the disparate pieces of the story, but then also one of the most powerful pieces of writing in the story. It's really interesting and ends up cutting through a lot of this cerebral mumbo-jumbo into something that is both relatable, deep, and haunting. So they mentioned that the question that was whispered into the child's tiny, close-set ear when he reached the front of the queue, "You, child, who are so gifted and sagacious and wise, is it possible that you have not realized the extent to which these primitive villagers have exaggerated your gifts, have transformed you into something you know too well you are not? Surely you have seen that they so revere you precisely because they themselves are too unwise to see your limitations. How long before they, too, see what you have seen when gazing deep inside yourself? Surely it has occurred to you. Surely one such as yourself must know already how terribly fickle the affections of a primitive third-world village can be. But tell me, child, have you begun yet to be afraid? Have you begun yet then to plan for the day when they wake to a truth you already know, that you are not half so complete as they believe? That the illusion these children have made of you cannot be sustained? Have you, for example, thought yet to break off and secrete a portion of their lavish offerings against the day they awaken to what you already know you are, and turn fickly against you, and then, because of their own turning, become disoriented and anxious and blame you further for it, see you as the thief of their peace, and begin to fear you and hate you in earnest, and before long perhaps even cease to bring you offerings in the hope that you will starve or slink off like the thief they now believe you to be?" So like I said, I think that this is the conclusion of the story, or the thing that unites all of the different investigations here, that this child is thought to be this wise thing that brings progress and evolution to society, but what he really brings is knowledge. And the shaman, maybe in his wisdom or just in his being a function of the story in order to deliver the message of either whoever originated the myth or just David Foster Wallace or any of the various narrators who are involved in the different frames of this story, is to tell us that it's not necessarily progress when knowledge dawns on a society, or when there is an apparent enlightenment. It might have as many costs as it does benefits to the society. And I think that this also harkens back to the meaning that we can find within that passage from Genesis about the awakening of Adam and Eve, that the details of their story aside, a big interpretation of this is often that it is an enlightenment, or it is about people gaining self-consciousness, and that is a result of them gaining knowledge. That's something about when humans woke up, either through evolution or through divine intervention or anything like that, and gained knowledge, we also gained self-consciousness. And that is definitely something that David Foster Wallace explores a lot in his writing, and I think is the conclusion of this story. The way that it ends is that the village decides to abandon the wise boy, and the warrior caste torches the village on their way out of town. And in the first variant, one of the warriors looks back at the fire, and in the second variant, it's a keen-eyed child that looks back at the quickly growing fire. And I think in either of these cases, like I said, it cements this idea that the knowledge ended up being a burden for this society. Even though it was an enlightenment that led to a lot of progress, it actually led them to basically short-circuit the CPUs of their brains, and they decided to abandon it. But I think in the case of the second variant of the keen-eyed child, the fact that he's keen-eyed might be an indication that he is wise himself. And maybe there's something inevitable about enlightenment or knowledge within humanity, that even though we can learn that knowledge has a destructive edge to it as well, it might still dawn on us regardless of our best attempts to evade it.